And now for something completely different. This episode, we're going to talk about a group of guys who formed in 1969 to create a television show for the BBC in the UK. The series ran for 3-4 years, not very long, but it made a huge impact on audiences around the world. After the series stopped, they decided that they'd go from the small screen to the big screen, and they started making movies. Then they branched out into books, live performances, and yes, some vinyl records. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. We're going to talk about the vinyl misadventures of Monty Python. So are you ready? Okay, let's run away. Let's drop the needle. Monty Python was Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Eric Idle, Michael Palin, Terry Jones, and Terry Gilliam. The name of their TV show was Monty Python's Flying Circus, and in 1970 they released their first album, which was also called Monty Python's Flying Circus. Now, at the time, I was a disc jockey living in Los Angeles, and as part of the underground scene, a number of us had heard about Monty Python, but we didn't really know much about them. There was a record store in LA called Aaron's, one of my favorite record stores, and they had a bin of English imports. And so one day I was there looking through these English records, see if there was anything interesting, and I came across this album. And I took it home, and so I got to listen to these Monty Python classic sketches before I had ever seen them perform them. My favorites on the record still are Flying Sheep, Nudge Nudge, know what I mean? Buying a Bed, Me Doctor, and Pet Shop. Now, interestingly enough, the BBC owns the copyright to this album, and it's the only piece of media that Python has ever done that they don't own the rights to. Now, in 1971, once again I'm in Aaron's going through their English imports, and I found a very strange album. It looked to be a classical album, but on the cover of it, someone had taken a black marking pen and X'd through that and scrawled another Monty Python record. Well, this was at the time of bootlegs, and bootlegs were where somebody would go into a concert with a little cassette tape recorder, hold it up, record the concert, and put it out on a record. The sound quality was horrible, and the covers were always very slipshod. And so I wasn't sure whether this was a real record or a bootleg. So I went to the clerk at the store and I said, "Is this really a Monty Python record?" And he goes, "Yes, it is, and it's great." And he was correct. Again, sketches are pulled from the TV series, this time from season 2. You get the amazing Spanish Inquisition in 4 parts: Contradiction, Spam, Be a Great Actor, and of course, Comfy Chair. Now, an interesting thing happened around this time. Python was getting popular from these albums. And so a number of my friends and I started quoting Python lines to each other, driving each other crazy. For instance, if I asked one of my friends a question, he'd look at me and before he'd answer, he'd go, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition." Or if we walked into somebody's house and they had a big overstuffed chair and you would sit down in it, you'd go, "Ah, comfy chair." It was a wild time. Their next album came out in 1972 in the UK, but it took us almost a year later to release it in the US. So once again, I got the English import. And on this record, they pull sketches from season 3. And this is the first time that Neil Ennis appears with Monty Python. Besides sketches from the TV series, the album also contains some original material. Some of the tracks are Dennis Moore, parts 1 and 2, Dennis Moore's Song, part 1, 2, 3, and 4, the classic Argument Clinic, Fish License, Eric at the Half a Bee, Massage from the Swedish Minister, parts 1, 2, and 3, and the Yancey sketch and the Yancey song. Now, if you heard the Yancey sketch and the Yancey song, you know that the Yangtze River is a river of many moots. Now, their next record came out in 1973 in the UK, but it took 2 years before it got released in the US. So again, I got the English pressing, and it's called Monty Python's Matching Tie and Handkerchief. Now, I have to tell you a funny story about this album. I got the English import, and I was living in a small apartment in Los Angeles, and so I took it back to the apartment, and it was kind of late at night, and it had been after dinner, and yeah, I had drank some wine, and I was feeling pretty mellow, and so I put it on my stereo, which is right across from my couch in the living room, and I listened to first side one, and it's pretty funny. And when it ends, I get up and I turn it over and put it on side two. I go back and I lay down on the couch. I start listening to it. But before very long, I drifted off to sleep. And the reason I woke up is because when the needle got to the end of the side back in those days, it would hit the label and it would go chicken, chicken, chicken. And the noise of that woke me up. So I get up. Well, now I'm awake. So I think, well, I didn't really hear much of that side. I'll play it again. So I put the needle down and I go back to the couch and I'm listening and I'm going, I don't remember it starting that way. And I listen to it all the way through and I go, yeah, I don't remember anything like that. So I get up and I pick up the needle and I put it down again. And all of a sudden, there's the stuff that I had heard before I fell asleep. And I pick up the needle and put it down again. And then there's the stuff that I heard the next time. I thought I was going crazy. So even though it was close to midnight, I called my friend and I said, I'm going nuts. And he goes, well, you got to play it for me. So I played it for him. I showed him how when I pick up the needle, put it down, it'd be one thing, and I pick up the needle and put it down, it'd be another thing. And he said, well, the only thing I can think of is that they cut 2 concentric grooves on that side. And depending where you put the needle down, depends on what track you're going to get. Now, the interesting thing was they never said anything about that on the liner notes. So it was a complete surprise to anybody who bought that record. And if you have an early pressing of the record, you can be sure you got a pretty rare record because it's probably the world's only 3-sided album. Now, when CDs became popular, they obviously couldn't do this on a CD because there is no needle dropping on the CDs. So what they did is they went back and they took those 2 concentric tracks and pulled them apart and sequenced them linearly. So that's how you get all of the information, but of course you lose the mystery third side. So side 1 has Dead Bishop, Word Association, Bruce's and Bruce's Song, Dr. Quote, and The Cheese Shop. Now side 2, if we look at Groove 1, it has the Background in History, Record Shop, First World War Noises, and Boxing Tonight. While side 2, Groove 2, has Mrs. Niggerbaiter, Oscar Wilde, Pet Conversions, and Phone In. Then in 1974, they decided to do a live act, and they appeared for a month at the Drury Lane Theatre in London. And on the last night of their performances, they recorded it and released an album, which was called Monty Python Live at the Drury Lane. And it sold very well in the UK, but it didn't even get released in the United States until 20 years later in 1994. Standout tracks include Gumby Flower Arranging, Wrestling, Idiot Song, Albatross, Nudge Nudge, Lumberjack Song, and The Parrot Sketch. Pushing up daisies, he's pining for the fjord. After the TV series ended, the Pythons decided, hey, let's make a film. Now, they had done a film earlier, which was really just recreating some of their sketches from their TV shows, and it was called And Now for Something Completely Different. But now they wanted to make an original film, and boy, did they ever. And people are still talking about that film today. It is a classic, and it's called Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So for their next album, it has to be a soundtrack. But you know, this is Monty Python. So the album is actually called Monty Python, the soundtrack of the trailer of the film of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And besides having pieces from the film on the album, they even stage a fake screening of the film and get critics' comments about it and everything. It's a pretty wild album. It was released in the UK and the US simultaneously, and that's the first time that's ever happened to a Monty Python record. But there's a joke, of course, on this album. It's called the executive version, because at that time, a lot of packaged media had a bunch of bonus material, making an executive version different than a regular version. So they called this the executive version of the soundtrack. But of course, there was no other version. Some of the